Hello and welcome to Pock and Rob. About 18 months ago when I started this channel, one of the things I did, one of the earliest series, was my ranking of all Paul McCartney post-Beatles solo records. Everything from McCartney 1 all the way through to McCartney 3. What I'm going to do this week, in honour of the fact that the man himself has turned 80 and is playing Glastonbury today, I am going to revisit that ranking. Now I've approached it slightly differently. What I've done is I've gone through each album. I've ranked each song out of 10 from 0, which is I would never want to hear this again, all the way up to 10, which I think is an absolute masterpiece and a gem. I've then averaged the ranking and ended up with a score. And I want to see if there's any significant differences between the way that I ranked the records 18 months ago and how I rank them now. I'm not including Electric Arguments, and I'm not including the Red Rose Speedway double that I did in the previous video. This is the 26 studio albums. Before I dive in, I'll just remind you to like the video, hit the subscribe button and the bell to receive notifications of future content, and we'll start with number 26, which is exactly the same as I ranked it before. Kisses on the Bottom. Now, this is the only album in his collection that I actually ranked as an average on the songs over there of under 4. This was 3.71 when it worked out. It's not that the songs are bad, they're not. They're mostly timeless classics. It's just a poor album, and I really don't think Paul's in good voice on this. I dislike it intensely. 3.71, it is comfortably the last place. Likewise, the next album on my previous ranking is the same as it is now, and this time the average is above 4. It's 4.44 for Driving Rain. There are several tracks on this that seriously drag down the okay tracks. I don't think I ranked anything above a 7 or an 8. There's nothing gem-worthy on here. And those Driving Rain terrible tracks like Rinse the Raindrops, which were zeros, really pulled it down even further. At number 24, I have placed Chubby B CCCP, back in the USSR. It's a rock and roll covers record. To be honest, I've heard it several times, but it's quite forgettable in terms of performance. The songs are, of course, great because they're all rock and roll classics, but it's not that great an album. And it got an average of 5 across the board. Just above it with an average of 5.13, and that has actually risen slightly, both in ranking and in terms of my affections. It's Wildlife. I have very recently got Wildlife on vinyl. It's the first time I've ever heard it on vinyl. And actually, even the tracks on side 1 that I would normally just dismiss, they sound a little bit better on vinyl than they do on CD. And finally, the next album with absolutely no change in where I placed it in my original rankings is Give My Regards to Broad Street. Now, it doesn't matter in the case of Give My Regards to Broad Street which version I consider, it would have landed in the same place. So the vinyl version is shorter, some of the tracks are curtailed, and for example, Wanderlust has got lost a minute. Now I love Wanderlust, that's a down mark. But on the flip side, the CD and cassette versions have nearly 9 minutes of Eleanor's Dream, which I think is garbage and a 0. And so that actually drags that down even more than the fact that on the LP it's only 2 minutes worth of it. It's a mess, but there's some really good songs on there, and No More Lonely Nights is a tenner for me. And that kind of almost rescues the album, but not quite. So the average was hovering around 5.5. From 21 onwards, everything is an average of 6 or above. And tied at position 20/21, we have Off the Ground, which didn't surprise me, and Memory Almost Full, which did surprise me. I think the fact that Memory Almost Full has got tracks that are, for me, 10 out of 10, probably puts it ever so slightly above Off the Ground. That 10 out of 10 track being Mr. Bellamy. Number 19, more or less where it was before, Red Rose Speedway. I think it's a mediocre album, I still do, but it does have Little Lamb Dragonfly. It's a tenner. Next up is McCartney 2. This is in exactly the same position as it was before, 6.18. Next up, and this was a bit of a surprise because it tumbled a bit, was Back to the Egg. I've always liked Back to the Egg, but when I really ranked those songs, it didn't come as highly as I thought. 6.36 for Back to the Egg. Tied with Pipes of Peace. Now this did surprise me, as this has risen slightly in where I'd ranked it. 6.36 for Pipes of Peace because of course it contains Through Our Love and Pipes of Peace, bookending the album, and actually really, really fine songs. Coming in at number 15 with an average of 6.4, but 6.6 if you consider the 13 track CD version, is Press to Play. At number 14, just landing in the bottom half of my rankings with 6.47, was a big surprise, Run Devil Run. Now, I've never really rated this record that highly. I don't find it a great listening experience, but I have to admit that he doesn't cover anything badly, and he actually covers some songs so well that they actually are amazing. And No Other Baby is brilliant. I've heard it said by other people on YouTube that No Other Baby does nothing for 3.5 minutes, but does it so well. Plus, his 3 originals on this record are really good. And there's a heart in the record that is excellent. Into the top half, and at number 13, with 6.5 and doing a big jump up, is London Town. Now, I did my ranking of the tracks on London Town recently, and I've got to admit there's more on here that I like that I don't. It's got With a Little Luck, and it's got I've Had Enough, and it's got Don't Let It Bring You Down, which are 9 and 10 songs. And suddenly, London Town, which was down near the bottom end, is kind of in the top half. The next is also a surprise because it's tumbled out of the top 10 for me, and it's Venus and Mars. This came in with 6.58, and for me, I think part of that is because when I truly think about it, this suffers in comparison to Wings Over America versions of virtually all the tracks that are on Venus and Mars. Without Crossroads, it might have been slightly higher, and I've always considered Venus and Mars a top 10 McCartney album for me, and suddenly it wasn't. And lastly, in this batch of things that landed in the 6s with 6.75 is McCartney. It has Maybe I'm Amazed, it has Junk, but it also has stuff like Valentine's Day, but nothing on it is bad. And actually, I like and have grown to appreciate Queen of Crore far more than I ever used to. And now we move into the top 10, and every single one of these albums is a 7 or higher. And at number 10, Flaming Pie, 7 out of 10. Why only 7 out of 10 for an album that is often cited as amongst his top 3? Well, the simple reason, Really Love You, the awful jam with Ringo, and Used to Be Bad with Steve Miller, which still is bad. It would be a better album were it shorter. I've said this before about Flaming Pie. You drop those 2 tracks and Flaming Pie becomes possibly close to an 8 because it really does drag them down. At number 9 with a score of 7.15 is New. Again, nothing poor on it, nothing that would be well below a 5 or a 10, with the exception of Road, which I think is a bit ropey. But Scared, the hidden track, I think is fantastic and kind of saves the ranking a little bit. And number 8 is my biggest surprise on this list, and just how high this album actually ended up, with a score of 7.27. It's Wings at the Speed of Sound. And generally speaking, I've not often rated Wings at the Speed of Sound that highly, but there are so many tracks on it I like, and only Cook of the House that I hate. That said, I think this is the perfect example of something being less than the sum of its parts, because the sum of its parts is 7.27, but when you listen to the whole album, it doesn't hang together at all well. And actually, it perhaps demonstrates the fact that an album is more than just a collection of songs, and in this case, it's less than its collection of songs. Getting the same score with 7.27 is McCartney 3. I was quite surprised that it was as low as this, given the fact that I don't think there's anything wrong-headed on this either, but then I remembered Deep Down. Next up with 7.75 is Flowers in the Dirt. So I think Flowers in the Dirt is a marvellous 10-track album that tumbles off the cliff with the last 2 tracks. You may be aware that on CD and on cassette when it was released, it had Où est le soleil. If you consider the 13-track album, the score of 7.75 tumbles down to 7.15 because I hate that track so much. Perfect example of an album that is better when it's shorter. Getting the same score, and again, this really surprised me that this came as low as it did, with 7.75, is Tug of War. Now, this was my number 2 McCartney album of all time. This is an example of where the songs themselves may get slightly lower rankings, like Be What You See or Dress Me Up as a Robber, or the couple with Stevie Wonder, but that they still hang as an album. And I think the album experience is greater, and the euphoric highs on Tug of War are what elevate it when I don't think about it song by song to a much higher position. Number 4, static as it was in my original ranking, is Egypt Station, with a score of 7.79. Yes, For You drags it down, but For You isn't that bad. I do wish he'd drop it from his set though, because clearly Paul thinks this is a great song. He played it last night at that secret gig in Frome. He's playing it tonight at Glastonbury, almost certain, and it's a terrible song. In third place, exactly the same as it was before, is Ram. And Ram gets a score of 7.82. It's Ram. Nothing bad on it, as I said on my track-by-track ranking. At number 2, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard with 7.92. If you consider I've Only Got Two Hands as being the album's additional track, it drops to 7.5, but it's a hidden track. If you take what's listed, this is nearly an 8 out of 10 album. And I think I've said before that Chaos and Creation doesn't have the same number of euphoric highs as something like Tug of War or Egypt Station, but it has a greater level of consistency than almost any other McCartney album, and I think that's reflected in the way that I've ended up ranking it this time. And finally, exactly as it was before, is Band on the Run. The only McCartney album that I gave a ranking on average to every track of over 8. It's 8.67. The gulf is quite marked. So that concludes my new ranking, having done it song by song and averaging. You should now be seeing on the screen a slide showing the comparison of 18 months ago when you just consider it as a whole album, and now when you do it song by song and average. I'll be back in a week with the final part of the top 100 songs that my son and I have been doing on the channel. Before I go, I'll just remind you to like, subscribe and hit the bell. But until next week, thanks for watching.